Hi, this is the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Kuestenmacher.
And me, wealth and property expert Michael Yardney. And this is where we talk about the demographic trends that are going to shape your future. But today we're going to talk about something a little bit different. What if I told you that the biggest threat to your business, to your investments, to your life in many ways, and simply the biggest opportunity is something you never saw coming. Now, in the early 80s, long before there was a TV show of the same name, economist Dr. Don Stammer taught me about watching out for an X factor, what's now called a black swan event. So, Simon, this is something that catches us by surprise. By definition, we don't even know it's coming.
That's the main idea, is there is always unexpected stuff coming, and we obviously don't have it on the radar. We always try to do, and we do this in our forecasting ourselves, we try to understand what is coming next, but we always use the existing trend, the existing knowledge base, and the things that we just see on the horizon to forecast these things. But the real X factors, they are of course the hardest to spot.
Well, I guess if you knew them, if you were prepared for them, they wouldn't be an X factor. And they could be global or domestic. They could be positive or negative. But one thing's certain, to be an X factor, they've got to have a profound impact. In fact, in many ways, an immediate impact on economies and property markets. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time just looking back in history, just so that we can share with our viewers and our listeners some of the things that happened. I mean, over the last couple of decades, boy, we've had plenty of them. I mean, there was the global financial crisis, COVID pandemic, global wars, record-breaking migration levels. So let's have a look at them, Simon. And I guess then let's see if we can take some lessons from them. So let's go back to 2024. That's the easiest one to remember. I think one of the big X factors that's going to have a demographic flavour to it as well is the record migration levels and the rising construction costs. We knew it was going to happen, but maybe not at the levels we expected.
Exactly, and there's of course always the question, who is who? From a demographer's perspective, you knew that migration was going to tick up. Just the idea was that you had negative migration outflow during the pandemic years, and then you play catch up once borders are open, once you can fill the international student spots at the universities again. But the sheer level, the sheer order of magnitude, that of course then was a surprise to go like, ooh, this is so much. And this, of course, hit in times of rising costs of living, housing unaffordability issues. So that did hit the Australian story very, very hard for 2024. But I would argue in the long term, when we look back a decade from now, this will probably not stick out as much as the X factors that occurred a couple of years prior.
Well, we'll get to that, but what do you think the big global X factor was in 2024, Simon?
Most certainly AI is the idea that we really understood the potential power of AI. Most people weren't quite sure what exactly this would look like in the short term in their particular industry. Are we threatening jobs? Will this lead to unemployed people? Will this mean that our productivity will just go up and that we create more riches for everyone? So that is yet to be determined on an industry by industry, business by business case. But so that's something that absolutely everyone became quite keen to learn more about. And you've seen all those statistics of the interviews of business owners and those surveys that just say the most concern for business owners is the impact of AI. They don't know what it's going to be like, and they're all trying to figure out what's going to happen.
Well, I guess that's what we're talking about with regard to an X factor. Now, sure, it was the big one for it's been around for a couple of years now. I think I first learned about ChatGPT just on 2 years ago. Having said that, though, I guess we've had Siri or Alexa on our phones, and so there's been a form of AI. But I guess the big X factor was how it has just blossomed, or is blossomed the right word? If it's good stuff or bad stuff, I don't know. So that was 2024. Let's just keep working back. And I guess the purpose I'd like to pick your brain on these ideas is just to remind our viewers and listeners that unexpected things can happen. In 2023, I think in the property world in Australia, one of the big X factors was the aggressiveness of the Reserve Bank's interest rate hikes, because only a couple of years earlier, the previous governor of the Reserve Bank, who lost his job, said, we're not going to have any interest rate rises till 2024. He put that out time and time again, and that was at the time that we were having our challenges with COVID. But the regressive interest rate rises had many Australians struggling. They were having difficulty managing their repayments because many had taken on home mortgages or investment mortgages at reasonably low, almost wartime interest rates.
The interest rates would have been super low for many, which of course led to you borrowing even more money. And that means then the aggressive interest rate hikes were even more impactful. They hit you even harder. And there was always this hope because you still remembered the old promise that interest rates were going to remain stable. In a sense, you anchored this expectation. And therefore, every interest rate hike felt even worse because you're like, no, this should be at this low level. We are being cheated out of a promise. But remember that there is no such thing as the RBA can't promise anything. So that's not going to happen. But it still feels, as a human, this feels absolutely brutal and devastating. And so that, of course, also depressed the general mood and confidence in Australia into the broader economy. And we still suffer from this, to be honest.
Well, that's interesting. Yes, that was one of the, is it an X factor, but one of the factors of 2023 that consumer confidence and business confidence really plummeted, didn't it?
It did, and it has to do with these expectations. You always set your mind to a certain something, and that is very, very much just psychological. It's not a hardcore analysis that people go through. You kind of had a gut feeling. And if this expectation gets changed, either upwards or downwards, your mood shifts. So every now and then we talk about a looming recession, and then it's actually just a little bit of a recession, and people feel elated about it. So it's not the actual number that we worry about. It is the psychological impact, because from this psychological impact, lots of consumer behavior flows as well.
I guess that's why I would call the Reserve Bank's aggressive interest rate hikes up till the end of 2023 an X factor, because no one expected as many. We expected some interest rate rises. And I guess if we look at the global factors in 2023, it wasn't that long ago, how persistent global inflation was, I think would have surprised many people, and that strained many of the world's economies.
Exactly, and it's one of those things where we realize we, of course, are obsessing about inflation issue, cost of living issues in Australia. But this is not an Australian phenomenon. This was very much to a degree, pandemic-induced idea of you just need to spend money like crazy in 2020, 21, 22, and then that drives up inflation. These are all inflationary spendings across the world, and the economies need to carry it somehow. And if you have inflation and you want to curb it, that is not easy. So you don't do this without pain. And this was a global phenomenon.
Well, it's interesting how one thing leads to another, because if I look back to 2022 and what the big global X factor was in 2022, I would put it down to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. That shocked global markets, and it actually fueled inflation and an energy crisis that fed into some of the things you were just discussing a moment ago. Now, in my naivety, simplicity, I would have thought that war would have been over in days or weeks, but it's now 2 years, it's 3 years on, Simon.
Oh, that makes you just
and it's still going on.
Putin. But yeah, this is of course an event that we would have all thought plays out quicker. And all of a sudden, this shuffled the cards, the geopolitical cards in Europe. All of a sudden, we see the Europeans essentially double their defense spending. And we have Poland spending more than 5% of their GDP on defense, very understandably. We see that out of the rising energy costs that the Ukraine war brought, essentially we're now seeing a toppling of the German government. All of those things are linked, and it's just one thing that we didn't expect. Yes, you could say, of course, there are plenty of geopolitical commentators who expected this, to be honest, but not the markets per se. This was not something that we timed, that we said there will be massive disruptions in the European energy markets, in global wheat supply. None of this was actually factored in. and then it hits us massively.
So each year there are challenges, and they do roll from one year to another, so it's a little bit hard as we're talking year by year. The year before that, maybe just back to Australia in 2022, that was the year that there was multiple interest rate rises. The Reserve Bank started in May and kept raising interest rates, catching many people off guard. But that all started in many ways the year before in 2021, when all of a sudden in Australia, the X factor was, hey, inflation is here. What's going on? For years, for decades, the Reserve Bank was actually trying to raise inflation by lowering interest rates. The decade before COVID, interest rates were kept on the low side to try and keep our economy just a little bit inflated. But I guess my Australian X factor for 2021 was the fracturing of that long dominant view that low inflation is here to stay. A whole generation of people had never experienced inflation.
Exactly. The risk there is always to take your most recent experience and expectations on an economic level, relatively low interest rates, and just think that this will play out forever. When you plan your future, you always want to do scenario plannings where you go, well, what if one of those major stable things that we assume was going to change? And one of them would be just money gets more expensive. And we discussed this in the past that the last decades, low interest rates, we will not see them in the coming decade. There is, of course, the political argument to be made, but there's also my simple demographic argument about this, which says that in the coming decade, we'll have super high consumption baked into the demographic pie, with the biggest generation of millennials going into the highest spending phase of the life cycle, the mid-40s, when you have kids and you have big mortgage costs and so forth. And the big baby boomer cohort isn't stopping their spending either, which is, of course, the richest generation in Australia. So that means, on average, money wants to be higher. The cost for money wants to be higher rather than lower. So I think this is what we need to broadly keep in mind when we forecast the future. You can, of course, hope for an RBA rate cut in early 25. That's a hope that you can have, absolutely. But don't expect a super low interest rate environment.
No, that's gone, hasn't it? But interestingly, for people watching this and listening to this, if you haven't heard Simon's predictions for 2025, we covered that in 3 separate episodes of Demographics Decoded podcast in January. So listen to this, watch this show today where we tell you about the unexpected factors, and then go back and have a listen on your favourite podcast app or on YouTube or Spotify to hear what Simon's predictions are for the future. So just because there's X factors doesn't mean we stop having expectations or predictions, Simon. The other big one for 2021 was that, looking back the year before, COVID was the big X factor for 2020. I think in 2021, the way we managed it, that vaccines came out so fast, so quickly, restored confidence pretty quickly in 21, and in fact led to an economic recovery when people were worried about what could happen around the world.
Exactly. This was the time when we always talked about the V-shaped recovery, when we saw all those indicators drop sharply, and then we said, well, how are we going to get out of this? And the ideal scenario was, well, let's assume we get a vaccine, let's assume we can open borders relatively quickly, and then we shoot up again to create this V-shaped recovery. Turns out...
Remember, there was Nike swoosh recovery, all sorts. They were trying to come up with clever names for what the recovery would be like.
Exactly. There were endless number of scenarios being thrown around, which was good fun, so to speak. But the idea is that we actually got the best scenario, and that's very lucky. And it really showed an impressive rollout of a medical system. And of course, it's a nice reminder when we talk about forecasting and X factors, is that the impressive vaccine narrative also created the exact opposite, a vaccine hyper-skepticism. And that is very much in line with standard forecasting methodology that says that every trend creates the exact opposite as well. Usually at a much lower rate, but every trend creates the extreme counter trend. As we double down more and more on AI, on self-driving cars, on tech everywhere, you'll see more people, a tiny minority, but more people choosing a deliberately analog lifestyle, we'll see more and more people, as cars become self-driving, purposefully still tinkering with old cars and driving them themselves and being seen as like super edgy by doing so. That's almost guaranteed to happen because every trend always creates the exact counter trend.
Never thought about that, because on the weekend around here you see people drive their old cars, the vintage cars, without the power steering and the automatic gears. So yes, there's always people who are going to be like that. So that was 2021, where at the beginning of the year there was the pessimism, having a lot of countries, a lot of cities locked down. I still remember the images from around the world. In Italy, the people who were singing outside their windows in 2020. 2020 was that year where COVID-19 created an unprecedented economic shock in Australia and around the world. I mean, you and I are both from Melbourne, and that's actually the year our friendship increased, because we both locked down and got to know each other over Zoom in those days. It was also an interesting year, Simon, 2020, when I remember your clever words. There were two sorts of days when we were locked down in Melbourne: the days that you bought things online to keep you happy and keep you sane, and the other days when you threw them out because you didn't really need them anymore.
Yeah, it's bizarre what kind of trends then occur when you completely introduce a new environment. And Melbourne, of course, was locked down, and so you go buy crap online. And that was fine, and you could do this until the global supply chains were interrupted as well. And then this stopped. And so then people took on hobbies, and they were kind of hobbies that all died. And you can look at this up right now on Marketplace. So everybody bought gym equipment to exercise at home, and they bought bread makers to bake bread. These are on Facebook Marketplace, on eBay. You find them in crazy numbers right now because people realized gyms are open again. I just rather go to a bakery. I'm not baking bread every day. That's too much effort. And we're now trying to push those things out of our life again. And maybe it's a bit of PTSD that is triggered with the dumbbells from the lockdown era.
Yes.
We shift behavior based on the major trends. And of course, if you were to forecast this, if you were to forecast that if there's a pandemic looming, we'll all buy fitness equipment, and you were just stocking up this equipment, you made a good buck. But this is where the power of forecasting comes in.
Sure. So at the beginning of 2020, no one really forecast this. COVID was the X factor. But I guess another X factor for the year was that despite the uncertainty, record low interest rates, government stimulus, remember there was JobKeeper, changes in housing preferences, all that actually led to the beginning of a once-in-a-generation property boom as buyers sought larger homes, regional properties, and over 2020 and 2021, property values skyrocketed when, in fact, a lot of people thought we were going to fall into a recession and property values would plummet, Simon.
And so there you see how the interaction works from what you expect, how you act then, because the fear was we stopped migration. We had negative migration intake in Australia. And so the idea was, well, if migrants drive the property prices up, they were now going to fall. And this will create a panic in the market. So how about we, of course, lower interest rates, and we ensure that we give money to people left, right, and center. And that then stopped the panic. So from that perspective, that was very helpful. But of course, it again led into the starting point of the ongoing high interest rate environment, the high inflation environment that we're in now. And you go, well, was this a good thing or a bad thing? Was it the right thing to do or not? We can't possibly answer it because we do not have the alternative scenario play out. And you can, of course, argue that ultimately, Australia went through a lockdown, through potential economic disruptions without all that much drama. In the bigger scheme of things, maybe that was worth it. But we will never, ever be able to know this. People will have very strong opinions in both directions. That's fair. But we can't really know what would have happened alternatively.
Well, from a demographic perspective, it affected different generations differently. As a baby boomer, I wasn't able to go on my overseas holidays and my cruises, and I know a lot of baby boomers felt they were cheated out of a number of years, of their silver years, golden years. On the other hand, the younger generations, it would have been terrible. I remember my grandkids were homeschooled. I used to have play games with them over the Zoom. It would have been very difficult for them. And what about those kids going through year 12 and finishing finishing off school or early university years. That must have affected them terribly.
Oh, absolutely. So in the generational research, we always talk about formative years. So roughly being 13 to early 20s. And that's when the events that are around you, they do not just impact you, they shape you forever. Everyone older than mid 20s during the pandemic years, yes, we were all impacted, but we weren't shaped in such a lasting way. So these are the most, for better or worse, this is not a judgment just yet, but this is the idea. They were impacted much more intensely than
Yes.
we were. Potentially, you'd say, well, what would this be like for the younger kids that are not even in the formative years? And we had a kid essentially at the beginning of the pandemic, March 2020. And so he was too young to be impacted by all of this. But if the pandemic was to be hit now and you have to control a, well, soon to be 5-year-old under these circumstances, that is much, much harder. I'm not sure if it's much harder on the kid or if it's much harder on the parents.
Yeah,
That,
both.
that would need to be seen. But I think for now, everyone is just happy to move on. And I think that's one of those other things is when we talk about those X factors, sometimes they have an impact and then life just washes over them.
Yes.
Ideally, we learn from them. Ideally, there's now a better economic and medical plan prepared for the next type of pandemic that will come eventually. We then better know how to handle it, depending on the medical implications of a new scenario. But that will now be front of mind. And I think, okay, if the next pandemic was to hit next Tuesday, I think we would handle it better than the past pandemic. But that's because right now a pandemic isn't an X factor. It's now something that we have actively in the memory. But the next X factor thing, whatever it is, that will hit us again utterly unprepared by definition.
You're right. So the next pandemic is no longer an X factor. It's expected. We just don't know exactly when. In my mind, the big X factor in Australia in 2019 was the unexpected federal election win by Scott Morrison. It was the election that Labor couldn't lose until they started talking about changing negative gearing and franked dividends and scared off investors. And interestingly, it depends how you look at it, that actually was a positive X factor because it boosted confidence amongst property owners who were worried that Labor would bring in oppressive tax measures.
Exactly. And again, all of those things depend on your point of view. If you look at this from an investment perspective, this was wonderful. All those taxes that you were afraid of to hammer down your property value, they did not come to fruition, so that was a win. If you were hoping for house prices to stabilize, to fall in order to enter the market, if you were a low-income renter or wannabe homeowner, these were difficult pills to swallow. And it, of course, then set the scenario that from 2019 onwards, both major parties learned to better not touch anything that could drive house prices down because it would lose you an election. And so instead of using this as a point to actually rethink our relation to property, which is what Bill Shorten tried to do, nobody touched it for 5 years. And so prices went up. This is good if you're in the game, but if it increased the income to house price ratio, you'll have more young people that are unsatisfied, which ultimately, I would argue, and we discussed it in the past, is an issue for the major parties because these voters will not forget that they dislike the two major parties. And as old people who are actually voting for the two major parties die off the voting register, you have more and more young people move into the market or into the votership that hate both major parties, and that's a structural risk for both Labour and Liberal in this country.
Now, as we discussed the X factors, as you said, many of them just lead to changes that we take for granted. And in 2018, in Australia and in property in my area in particular, the Haynes Royal Banking Commission exposed widespread misconduct in the financial service industry and also poor lending practices and maybe inadequate safeguard of borrowers. So as a result of that, banks tightened their lending criteria significantly, and they're still that way today. On the one hand, there are the rising property prices that you just mentioned. On the other hand, the banks were making it harder for buyers to secure loans. They reduced credit availability. And this led to a bit of a slowdown in the property markets, particularly Melbourne and Sydney, which actually had a bit of a speculative boom for a little while before that. But on the other side of the world, there were escalating trade tensions with the United States and China that affected us.
Exactly. So this is still under a Trump presidency, or Trump 1.0 at this point in time. Of course, a tough rhetoric against China, and so that then always had the question. Also, this was always the looming trade war. So we didn't know in 2018 if there would be a full-on trade war in 2019. We just had no idea, but it was always discussed as being an option. And so then you go, well, what might this be like? The Australian dependency on China as a trade partner was higher than ever before at this point in time. And so we said, maybe we scale this back a bit. So there has been a bit of we didn't divest from China or anything, or we didn't soften our relationship, but we ensured that the share of exports that go to China, we wanted to moderate this a bit. We set the beginnings of this moderation that now is in place. We set this then. So we react to those things that we experience as an X factor in the moment.
If I'm not mistaken, that was also the time when there was all this ongoing discussion about Brexit, about Britain leaving the European Union, which eventually happened. I'm not sure whether that was a good or bad thing.
Well, at this point, Brexit was relatively fresh, and we then started to sort things out. And the hope, if you were a pro-Brexit voter, was still that prosperity in the UK was upon you, and finally the things will turn for the better. We know now, with 7 years hindsight, that this is very much not how it played out. That essentially every economic indicator in the UK got worse. Nigel Farage would tell you a different story. He would come up with some other narrative, but nothing changed for the better in the UK. And so you don't know this. So it's always you have the hope that something changes, but these are super complex issues, even if it might look very simple on a ballot, yay or nay, but the implications are much, much bigger and always hard to know, because the Brexit, of course, also occurred then during a pandemic, during tightened tensions in Europe. So granted, this is not easy. If you want to transition an economic model, that was, of course, the worst of times to pull off a Brexit. Would have been easier to be in the negotiations, some sort of like economic mini boom in the early 2010s, mid 2010s. That would have been better, but you can't pick and choose.
Now, what we're doing is just going back down memory lane, Simon and me, thinking about the X factors affecting Australia, affecting the world economy. If you're getting some benefit from this and you don't currently subscribe to Demographics Decoded on whatever podcast app you're watching or listening to this, just stop for a sec and click subscribe or follow, whatever it says. Also, it'd be great if you told your friends about the show as well, so that we can get our message out to more people. Now, in general, our discussions are about what's going to happen in the future, but going back in memory also gives us some good lessons, doesn't it, Simon?
In forecasting, looking back is one of the most common ways of making conclusions about the future. So it's always very, very helpful. And it's a shocker in preparation for this podcast, just to realize that things that you, in the back of your mind, still have marked as very recently, already 8-9 years in the past.
Well, that's the scary thing, isn't it? How long ago all these things were. If we go back a couple of years earlier, there was in Australia, and in property in particular, from 2014 onwards, there was a sudden surge of Chinese foreign investments in property, which led to a couple of other X factors in future years. So an X factor for 2014 would be all the overseas investors driving significant demand for new and off-the-plan apartments, all those towers that we now see around our capital cities, that led to construction, particularly in Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. And there was a point where, in fact, 50% of all purchases in Sydney, all finance approved in Sydney, was for investors, and that led to, I guess, a level of speculation that if APRA hadn't stepped in, could have led to a reasonable downturn, because every large speculative boom leads to a bit of a downturn. So in 2015, APRA introduced stricter lending criteria, put a cap on how much banks could lend to investors. And that surge in foreign investors also disappeared as the government took away the welcome mat. It put extra restrictions on foreign investors. They always were restricted to only buying new or off-the-plan properties, but extra taxes. I guess that was one of the other X factors maybe for only the last couple of years, the property investor bashing. We never saw much of that before.
And of course, the original Chinese surge of investment into Australia has a Chinese and an Australian end. Australia was very keen to build more apartment towers, and in order to build them, you need to sell them before you actually start,
Yes.
digging the first hole. Foreign money was available because Chinese investors they looked at, of course, remember 2014, if you looked at the Chinese GDP growth per capita, per year was gigantic. And so you'd go, what kind of moron who owns Chinese money invests them outside of China? You can't possibly get the same return in Australia, even if it's a great apartment, great investment, than you would in China. And so this is when a couple of people were like, maybe those Chinese investors actually do know a bit more than we do about the Chinese economy. Maybe some of these Chinese growth is actually overblown, which is why we saw such big capital flight from China. And we, of course, happily introduced a investment vehicle for this money. And then we reined it in because we realized, maybe that's a bit too much. It's politically very unsatisfying. And it did, of course, lead to a couple of empty apartments and so forth. And we then tried to adjust it. It's again another forecasting truism. Regulation follows innovation. The innovation was, just take foreign money to build apartments, and then it gets regulated eventually.
Well, you talked about the Chinese boom, the Chinese economy. If you go back to 2012, for example, the Chinese spectacular economic growth started to slow down. But for the couple of years beforehand, the Chinese growth led to Australia's economic growth as well, to a degree that we didn't really expect.
No, and that's you attach yourself to a bigger economic power, and then you piggyback on their success. This is the exact model that Australia has been operating for the last 120 years, or even longer than that, to be honest, is to first the UK, then the US, and now China. And at the moment, we are stuck in the middle. We're trying to figure out what we're actually doing next. It served Australia well. And Australia is usually served well to understand that we are not the main act. We are the support act, globally speaking, in the economy. And if you then just play your cards nicely, you don't rock the boat too much, you get to create prosperity in-house. And if you bet on the wrong horse, you might hinder economic growth.
Interesting. So if we go back another year, 2011, there were devastating floods in Queensland. I remember those well. They severely impacted the state's economy and led to damage, terrible damage. But I guess that's each year we get those weather X factors in Australia. But I very much remember the big global one for 2011, the Arab Spring uprisings that spread across the Middle East and North Africa, leading to overthrow of government. In fact, Pam and I were on vacation in the Middle East, and we'd just done a tour of Egypt, and we'd gone down the Nile on a beautiful boat, and we were leaving the country, and we were told, stay in your hotel at night, don't go out, there's going to be riots. So out of the blue, all of a sudden, in the beginning of the year, the world changed over there.
Yeah, and remember the narratives. This was about social media is spreading information faster than ever before. Of course, 2011, social media was still very, very new as a phenomenon. We saw the power of Twitter, the power of Facebook to push those messages out. There were plenty of columns being written about this will introduce democracy to the Middle East. Look at the flourishing democracies across the Middle East. Looking back 14 years from then, this didn't occur because autocracies around the world can also use the same tools. So the same tools that could be used to spread democracy and freedom of thought and equality can also suppress all of this. And it's funny that we didn't have this on the radar as much. We thought this was a one-way street that always ends at more freedom. Wonderful book written by an author called Anne Applebaum, who wrote a book called Autocracy Inc. Just about this topic is we can use all the technology that we could use for good, we can use for bad, and the autocracies around the world have done an amazing job in limiting freedoms. Just from a technological perspective, kudos to them.
Well, going back, we could discuss things year after year, but there's maybe just two more I'd like to throw out and have your thoughts on. 2008, the global financial crisis. No one really saw it coming, but should have in retrospect. In Australia, there was no doc loans. People would give you the ability to borrow money just because they could. You didn't have to justify or prove that you could pay things off. But it was even worse overseas, where in America, the banking system was not as secure as Australia, but if it hadn't gone down there, we could have ended up with a lot of financial problems back home.
Exactly. And it shows that in forecasting something like a banking crisis, you actually need to understand it. And nobody understood anything that was going on there. So like you talk to CEOs, they don't know how the financial models work. They don't know how mortgages were cut and diced and resold. It was too complex. And we figured, you just looked at the bottom line figures for now. I was like, well, it makes us money. That'll do for now. And so we do always need to remember that systems that we're operating in, that we rely on, tend to be very, very complex and intricate. Like we don't understand them. That's the main point. And if you don't understand something, how can you be absolutely certain that it will be stable into the future? And most systems that we look at, we don't fully understand, to be quite fair.
Now, looking back even further, there was the September 11th terrorist attack in the United States, the Asian financial crisis, Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the collapse of communism. Boy, when the Berlin Wall came down. So there were all these things that were X factors. I think, Simon, the message should be getting across to our listeners and our viewers that trying to predict X factors is futile. Well, look, by definition it is, because there's surprises no one sees. But I think acknowledging their inevitability helps you prepare.
It does. Quite often when you study history more and more, there's certain kind of patterns that you might recognize in the future. Ai Weiwei, the Chinese artist in exile in New York, I think at the moment, has this beautiful quote where he says, when a leader looks the strongest, he quite often is at his weakest. And this is, he of course referred to Xi in China at the moment, who looks incredibly strong, looks like he purged all the power of the communist parties that might oppose him, and so he seems unbeatable at the moment. But in this quote and reading of Chinese history by Ai Weiwei, it says, well, this is very much not a given. You look at the Assad regime in Syria that fell at a point when it did look strong. Your general perception can fool you quite often in forecasting, so you always need to be humble enough when making an investment decision anyways to know that something can change completely, and you never have any right for your investment decision to be right into the future all the time. Complaining about it is futile. It is always to be at the front foot, to focus on your what your investments is, to diversify your investment portfolio. All those stock standard truisms that are always right are actually always right.
Interesting. Well, I know you spend your days advising businesses, organisations, institutions and even governments about what's ahead for the future. So that's what you at the Demographics Group do. And I'll leave a link in the show notes, because if people would like to get your thoughts about this, they can actually have a chat with Fiona and see how it could all work. This is what you do all day, Simon.
That's what we do, and it's always fun to view the world always through the demographic lens, through an economic lens as well, and then apply it on all different types of industries. And again, it's well and truly my belief that if you view the world from multiple perspectives, you can make better decisions. And I always offer, this is what we do in this podcast, we offer the demographic perspective in the hope that it helps you to make better decisions in your well, no, I want to say love life, in your business. Let's start with business. That's for another podcast to solve your relationship problems.
Now, normally we do talk about the future, but when we get together next week, I'd like to do it slightly differently. I'd like to not talk about the things that are going to change, but I also think it's important to understand the things that will not change moving forward, because sometimes that's even more important.
Exactly. It gives us a sense of the stability that even when you hear things like times have never changed as fast as they have now, but certain things are not changing. So keep this in mind, that ultimately the future will look more like the present than you might think.
Okay, something to look forward to. Look forward to catching up with you next week, Simon.
Fantastic. Catch you next week.
This Demographics Decoded podcast has been brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Just go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property advisory, wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team at Metropole will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades and we've been helping clients with for well over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. In between these Demographics Decoded shows, you can follow me on social media, and I suggest you also follow Simon Kuestenmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all social media platforms. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody who may also benefit, please tell them about Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to be shaping their future. And of course, if you don't currently subscribe, we'd love you to. And of course, any of the information that we've been sharing with you is general information because we don't know your specific circumstances.